Welcome to the Reimagining Real Estate Sustainability Summit 2020, organised by CREtech and co-chaired by the British Property Federation and UK Green Building Council. I'm Melanie Leach, I'm the Chief Executive of the British Property Federation, and for this session I'm in conversation with Duncan Owen, Global Head of Real Estate at Schroders. And we're going to talk about people, planet, place and prosperity. Does real estate hold the key to a more sustainable future? Duncan, why don't you start by telling us a little bit about Schroders' approach to sustainability?
Yes. Well, the Schroders approach in the real estate division has been evolving rapidly over the last 3 or 4 years. And what we've done, we've decided to try and focus as much as we possibly could on those areas where we would make a difference. And obviously those areas that would be related to the built environment and would have a physical impact and could produce carbon footprint. And being a fund manager, we went away and had a look at the statistics. And one of the best dials and indicators we concluded was the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And I think they're well used now. And there's some 18 of those goals in total. When we reviewed them, we thought that there were 4 key things that we could have a key measurable positive impact. And they have become known as our 4 pillars, if you like. And it's the positive impact we can have on people on the ground, on the planet, of course, with climate change very much in mind, place and sustainable cities, and of course, prosperity and the improvement of wealth and quality of life and returns for investors, as well as improvements for occupiers of buildings and built environment. So we're very much focused over the last few years increasingly those 4 pillars.
And just before we come back to the substance of that and talk about that in a bit more detail, just tell me a little bit about how the events of the last few months, coronavirus, and the massive impact that's had on the real estate sector, on all of our lives as individuals. Has that knocked you off track? How have you had to reassess in the light of COVID?
We're certainly, like everyone, having to do things a little bit differently. I think what the key change has been is accelerated some of those themes that were already in place. We see that with many themes and many businesses, and talk about how there were structural changes already, not least of which physical retail, for example, and it's changed dramatically. People looking at home delivery. And of course, from Schroders and how we've adapted, I think it's accelerated a number of things that were in chain already. For example, agile working has been something that the group has really wrapped its arms thoroughly around. And that doesn't mean everybody works from home. It doesn't mean everyone works in the office. Equally, we've tried to give some guidance, but that's very much been in lockstep with what I would call the TMT or the technological revolution. There's already a structural change in place for everybody, and that doesn't just mean Amazon. That means of course how you work and how you invest in your IT platform and how you can enable people to work more agilely. Which means when they come to the office, it's fine, but equally if they're not in the office, it's fine. And I think for me, many of us already were having to work in an agile way because of travel, because of being out of various meetings, but it's brought greater focus to that. And it's really put an importance and accentuated wellness. So people don't get frustrated. It can make things easier for people to work in a more flexible approach. And I think that very much points, in my mind, toward the S in ESG being accelerated more than we would have perhaps expected before COVID.
And is leadership an important part of that? Have you felt very much that your personal role is to help sort of champion that belief and that way of approaching challenges?
Yes, it is, and I think we're all learning as we go. I wouldn't pretend for a minute that we all get that right, and I certainly don't. But there are 2 ways of doing that. One is trying to make sure that you set the right example, and that people don't feel forced into one behaviour or another, because there cannot be one rule fits all. Some people working from home is enlightening and enabling. For other people, it's possibly one of the worst things that could happen, dependent on their location. So that's one example of being flexible and really leading by example. And I think the other thing is we've tried to illustrate, and it's not just me, Schroders have said, that there are no hard and fast rules, but we would expect it normally for people to at least work from home 1 day a week. We haven't said that's a strict minimum, but we've encouraged no more than, at least a day a week. And we've encouraged perhaps 2, maybe 3 days, dependent on circumstances. And I think the phrase I heard at one of our management committees, which summed it up, was we used to come to the office to work, and of course we don't now. We come to the office to meet people and investors and clients and counterparties, and we stay at home to work. And it's quite a nice, distinct way of putting the changes.
Thank you. And so we've talked a little bit about sort of the internal philosophy of the business, but what about your investors? What are you hearing from them, and has that changed over the last, since you launched your strategy, or over the last 6 to 9 months? Where are investors in all of this?
Yes, it has changed, but I have to say it's still quite disparate. There are some geographies, it's very difficult to generalize, but there are some geographies and some types of investors who are right at the forefront. One of the largest mandates in real estate we've ever taken on board is in the process of being taken. And I won't name them, and I'll spare their blushes. But they have insisted there are a number of ESG goals and objectives which are measurable, which are at the forefront as whether in the future they retain us as a manager. And in the past, those KPIs would have exclusively been financial. And they still remain financial, but there are a number of things which are obvious things, like reducing use of energy, reducing the carbon footprint, as well as less obvious things, which are more social and improvements in the built environment and the environment and space people have. So that's one example of a client that's really putting it out there that this is something that's going to be measured, and you could be removed as a fiduciary of their capital if you don't adhere to the ESG objectives as much as financial. I have to say there are others where whether it's their local environment that they're in, but it seems less important. And you can certainly imagine from certain geographies in the world, they'll look across and they'll say, well, it's okay for people in the developed world to have this attitude, but we don't have any number of these other advantages, and it's much more difficult. It's a much bigger challenge for us to put the same things in place. And so I think it's something that we need to be very careful about, and we need to help try and work with clients. Dare I say, to a degree, help educate them, but in other cases, there are clients and investors that are educating us.
And do you think the attitude of governments has a part in that as well, in shaping how investors approach things, and indeed in shaping how you as a business approach things?
It does, and it's important. But as we've seen with things such as the Paris Accord, etc., the plea that we would have to governments is consistency. What we really need is people to take a consistent approach, because things, whether it's climate change, whether it's rules, reduction of carbon footprint, whether it's trying to improve local prosperity and using local labour when you redevelop or refurbish an office or shopping centre, what we really need are consistency. Because as we've learned, one country is a shining beacon, or some certain government policies have certain rules, but they're inconsistent, or there isn't a key agreement on those. It makes it very difficult indeed, both for people that supply us as well as people things that we do. So my main plea to governments is yes, do the right thing and make it measurable. Yes, even put in place incentives, tax breaks and such like for people who are doing the right things, or tax penalties for people who are doing the wrong things. But there has to be greater consistency. Yeah.
I guess as long as the government is leaving a gap for you to be proactive in, effectively, are you arguing that there's a competitive advantage for Schroders as a fund in being upfront with your goals, with your commitment, and trying to deliver that alongside attractive financial returns to investors? Does that give you an edge in the competition for funds?
Well, in a way, sadly, it does to a degree. I think most people now have moved from want a better description from the dark ages, where we've gone from a sort of safeguarding objective to perhaps my activities will now be so we won't harm things, to people now accepting that they need to actually substantially contribute to the positive way. And I think that does give you a competitive advantage, but I'd probably turn it on its head and say it's actually, because most responsible investment managers, investors wanted to be doing it, it's actually a real disadvantage if you're not, you're left behind. And I do think that's terribly important, because much as it's great to have an advantage, it means a lot of people are still not doing the right thing, and so it's difficult to have in aggregate a positive impact.
And come back to that issue of how you demonstrate positive impact as opposed to doing no harm in a second. But before I do that, I'd just like to unpack that kind of link between financial performance and social value performance, sustainability performance a little bit more. I mean, you know, I suppose 5 years ago, having this conversation, we probably have assumed it was either or, and you couldn't have both. Has that really changed, or
yes.
You know, are we still? Is it still to some extent the choice?
It's changed. There is very little evidence that the diehards can say there is a headwind in getting as good performance by doing the right thing. It is almost at the tipping point where you're going to get at least as good, if not better, return by doing the right thing. And examples always bring this to light. And I think one, for example, would be redevelopment or refurbishment, repositioning of offices. As people return to our offices, as they will be sure at some stage, people need to work together, they need to sit and meet and have creative ideas, they need to ensure their culture's there and people are, you know, just generally working with colleagues and having fun. And I think if you create the right environment, there will be stronger demand. Those properties will be more attractive to occupiers, and you will get better returns. If you don't, if it's the old, increasingly obsolete office property, or you could say shopping centre for that matter, or pick any subsector of property market, it will be a place where people don't even want to go and shop because the experience isn't right. It will be a place where people don't want to go and work because the experience isn't right. And actually, above all, they won't get a feeling of safety and general wellness. And it's simple things, that they really are simple things that will make a difference. Yeah, natural ventilation for use of air conditioning rather than recycling of the old air, etc. There's many examples like that you can do that will help the financial returns, as well as various KPIs to do with ESG. And I think that's really important for people to acknowledge you're probably going to get better returns from doing the right thing.
And are those the kinds of things you're thinking of when you talk about, as Schroders does, your philosophy of positive impact in investing? How do you demonstrate that in practice? Is that the kind of thing that you're thinking of when you talk about positive impact investing?
Yes, it is. And of course, some things are easier to measure than others. So there are some things for the redevelopment of Bracknell Town Centre. I could pick various developments in Berlin or Paris recently, but Bracknell's a good one. It created 3,500 new jobs. The actual development process, which is now finished, had a real focus on local contractors, workers, and there was a real positive impact on local people. On the other side, it was a real regeneration, and this is as often as not in any CBD, central business district, with offices and refurbishment that you undertake. If you're not redevelopment or improving brownfield, you're improving the built environment. Whether it's planting trees, whether it's making the environment more safe, it's a better place for people to enter and exit, and it's a better environment for them to be there inside. That's a little bit more difficult to measure, but you can definitely feel it, and it definitely has a great alignment with what we were talking about earlier, the better financial returns. People like going in a nicer area, a nicer space, a greener space, a safer space, a space where now more than ever they can find multiple ways of accessing it. It's not just one type of public transport or private transport or cycling, etc. They want multiple options. And so I think that's a really good example. Hopefully that answers the question.
Just picking up that point around green space and the way that's become so much more important to people over the lockdown period in particular. Do you think that will cause you to actually rethink some of the projects you're already involved with, as well as the way you think about future projects?
Yes. Yeah, and it's interesting you say that, because it has done to a degree already on a couple of projects. It's partly been measurement, not for measurement's sake, but the measurement has made us stop and think, because if the score on something wouldn't be as good, you can actually end up changing what you're doing as a consequence, which of course has a real positive impact rather than just for the sake of measurement. But I think one of the interesting things which stood out to my mind is we set a goal of reducing the use of our energy by about 8% per annum compounding across all of our portfolios, physical portfolios that we invested in. And at the moment, we've reduced the amount of energy that we use by 15.4%, which is when I say used, I mean consumed. And that's definitely been a change for the better, and we hope that that's going to have a compounding effect, because in order to achieve that, what we've done and what we put in place was over 87% of the UK portfolio, for example, and this is echoed elsewhere across Europe and in Asia, real estate portfolios. 87% of the electricity we now use is from renewable. And we achieve that partly from introducing all sorts of efficiencies and energy reduction, and whether, again, that's the simple examples, more efficient use of the energy and equipment, light bulbs, etc. But we literally, by focusing on energy consumption reduction, part of the answer to that was it changed how we went about planning and refurbishing things, and getting the type of energy into the building with it being renewable was a really positive change.
Thank you. And we've talked quite a lot about people and place. So let's talk a little bit about prosperity and this concept of inclusive growth and bringing prosperity through the delivery of projects. What does inclusive growth mean to you?
Well, everybody, it's one of those awful cliches at the risk of saying it, but people will look for win-wins. And it goes back to the KPIs of financial returns and KPIs of ESG. When you boil them down, there are at least two parties in investment medium that have impact. So one is, yes, you want to get the best returns, and it's inclusive for investors. So they will deploy their capital, improve the built environment, because they're getting the right returns. But that, of course, to be inclusive, has to also impact physically on the occupier. So better space, and it might lead to better productivity and better efficiency, but it's got to have a better environment. It's got to be safer. It's got to be something that is more efficient, where they know they're using less energy, or they have use of grey water in the building, etc. So that's one example of it being very inclusive for both the owners and they're both aligned. Another, I suppose, of course, is diversity. And for it to be inclusive in an absolute sense, it's back to the people, and if you like, the 4 Ps, the people, planet, place, and prosperity that we focus on as our 4 pillars. And it really has to be inclusive, and diversity, of course, means everything. And again, what we can do by having criteria that we are asking suppliers, service providers to ourselves, as well as how we behave and how we look at ourselves, we're looking for inclusivity, because one, you get better outcomes. It's proven almost by every study that the more diverse in gender and race, etc., that you are, the better the thought process is, and the better the ultimate solution. And so that's inclusion, again, work for everybody. It's better all round. And diversity needs to be in its broadest sense. I think a lot of people often talk about gender diversity. And I think that's justified. And you would say, for example, women have been the largest single group prejudiced against, because roughly half the world's population, but they're being prejudiced against. So you have to improve in that sense of diversity there. But of course, that's just one part, both in getting different thoughts and diversity of thoughts. It's just one part of it. So you've got to be inclusive all round. Really take care that you're not just focusing on helping one part or one subsect of the population.
And it's probably fair to say that as an industry, as a real estate industry, we've not been at the forefront of creating a diverse and inclusive industry. But are you optimistic that we're making progress, even if we've still got a way to go?
Yes, we are, because the rate of progress is accelerating. I have to say, I think it's been one of the easier things to win. I mean, I've heard now several commentators who are really expert in the content. If you look at ESG, people have got environment and climate change, and they've got governance. And governance means a number of things, good governance, but diversity is part of it. What we're still grappling with, I think we're making headway to a lesser extent, is the S and social, how you can have that positive social, because the E and the G, I won't for a minute suggest that those battles are totally won, but no one's arguing. Well, at least very few people are arguing against them. There may be notable exceptions. But I think the social side is something that we do need to work hard on, because it's often more difficult to measure, which doesn't mean it's less right or it's a less important thing. But sometimes people's utility value is difficult to measure. And I think diversity does cut across a number of the E and the S and the G.
Yeah. And just thinking about that challenge of social impact then, I mean, what's the balance of the different actors in all of that, across the investors, across you as a business, across government, across local communities demanding more? How is that actually going to get driven, and who are going to be the key actors in that?
You need positive discrimination. It's a dirty word in some. I can be dispassionate because there's at least one outstanding example where it was required and resisted and has subsequently been proven to be right. For example, in Africa, particularly South Africa, where I forget what the exact percentage of black population was compared to white, but without positive discrimination, the vast majority of people in that environment were never going to even have the opportunity to prove themselves, let alone prove themselves. And I think about how rapidly that it's just demonstrably had a positive impact already as a result of that. I think what may have been a decade ago a dirty expression, but positive discrimination, I think, is something that people can realistically see the benefits of. I know there isn't a consensus on that, but otherwise it's very difficult to get change at the rate that we need.
Thank you. We're coming to the end of our session, so I'm going to finish by coming back to the E of ESG. We're talking about within a real estate sector that accounts for around about 40% of global carbon emissions, and we have a global target of 2050 to get to net zero, and indeed, many businesses are setting more ambitious targets than that. How optimistic are you that as a sector we can play our part in delivering on that ambition?
I am optimistic, very. I think the lesson that we've learned is, like so many things and good causes, in that you don't arrive. It's not you can't be a traditional alpha and say, well, here's the problem and here is the solution. When we get there, we've solved it. It's something that really is a journey. Because you never really quite arrive, because there are so many areas to strive for improvement. And I think if I have one concern, It's that people psychologically get it's something that is absolutely continuous, and it's not a sprint to a line. You cross the line, and everyone can have a deep sigh. I think you've cured it. What we know, if you just take climate change as an example, that's something that has to be permanent, just as good governance does. And I don't think the train arrives at the station, everyone can get off it and say, right, we've cracked it, global warming is now slowing. Because we know there's a risk that it would just come back if people don't see it as a permanent change.
Thank you. I found that absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much indeed to Duncan Owen, Global Head of Real Estate at Schroders, for joining me in conversation. Thank you.